Hello there and welcome to ChangeX. Tonight is all about your future identity and how to make yourself future-proof when it comes to managing your personal data. Now, my name is Michiel, I will be your host, and as part of the ChangeX team, I want to thank you for tuning in. And here at ChangeX, we aspire to inspire young professionals and our fellow innovators. So welcome, and yeah, buckle up, because we are having quite a show for you with Henk van Cann, who is an IT entrepreneur and also a leading expert in open public blockchain and the founder of blockchainbird.org, if you want to visit the website. Now, tonight he will tell you all about future identity and how to manage your data, as I said. And he will also be joining our chat here on Vimeo, as well as the live Q&A session on Zoom. So make sure to tune into the chat and the Zoom, and you can find the Zoom link in your email and in the chat. This is definitely not something that I am familiar with, so I'm very excited about today's presentation. I can imagine you're too, so yeah, let's dive straight into today's presentation by Henk van Cann.
Thank you, Michiel. You control, therefore you are, and you get to decide. The role of blockchains, cryptography and cryptocurrencies in autonomic decentralized identifiers on the internet. That's a mouthful of terms and it may sound like gibberish, but we'll explain them in this presentation. Cryptography is going to save my digital me. So that's one of the three terms there. The identifiers are decentralized, but somebody and someone controls them, of course, still. And that's my first cliffhanger. So I'm the founder of blockchainbird.org, and my Twitter handle is on top of this slide, and that's @Henk van Cann. What we do at blockchainbird.org is we fund projects that make a better world, and especially projects that are in the digital identity field. So do we need and can we get more trust and more privacy over the internet? The simple answer is yes, we can. The more complex question is, why do we need more trust? And how can we get more trust and more privacy and more control on the internet? Buckle up and join me on this exciting journey. I think, therefore I am. That was a philosopher from the 16th century. And I use that sentence for a nowadays term, and that's I control, therefore I am. It fits more to the digital world. Cryptography is going to save my digital me. What does that mean? What is cryptography? And besides sounding very boring, who is digital me? Why do we need to be saved? Some people say, I've got nothing to hide. Is that true? I think you've got a lot to hide nowadays on the internet. And that's where we start from. What you've got to hide is all the wrong conclusions that are drawn from raw data on the internet. So that's what you've got to protect, and you've got to control, and you want privacy around that. But first, the terms. There's a lot of confusion in the identity world, and for example, identity is a very vague term. It's, in fact, how we keep track of people and things, and in turn, how they keep track of us. That's pretty vague. It's more easy to talk about identifiers, because identifiers, they point to identity. An example of an identifier is, for example, your email address or your home address somewhere in a database. And also your social security number is an example of an identifier. So an identifier is not identity. An attestation is a statement that some authority makes about identity. For example, you've got a driver's license. So the driver's license number is your identifier, but the driver's license is an attestation. And we can connect attributes and rights and licenses to these attestations. So for example, all these things in my wallet, like my bank card or my driver's license, they are not identity. They are not identifiers, but they are attestations. We call them also virtual credentials. That's another name for them. And an attestation is a typical thing because it puts you in a certain role. So as soon as you, for example, have your driver's license, your role is an authorized driver on the road. Another example is if you've done your exam, you pass your exam, you get your diploma from school, and then you're a graduate at that school. So that's a role. And a role and also attestations are, of course, again, not identity. Now that these terms are hopefully more clear, we can continue. What is a decentralized digital identifier? Because that's a bit more specific again. So there's two words, digital and decentralized. Digital, of course, means that it's in bits. We don't have it like here, the plastic cards in my wallet. And decentralized means that no single entry or no single entity can control my identity. So it's spread out all over the internet or different databases. And as I promised before, somebody controls it. And who should control it? Of course, we want to control it to a certain extent, because we want to have more privacy and we want to have more trustworthiness on the internet. So let's get to the examples of digital identities. For example, a healthcare number at your hospital is an example of an attestation. So you have your number there and you want to protect that information behind that number. For example, your record. These records are available in the databases of your hospital, and you can't control them because in that domain of the website of your hospital, that's where your identifier resides. So you can only access that with a username and a password. Is that enough? Or do we want more? What do these identifiers mean to us? If I can't really control them, I have to log in at the hospital. Three more terms that I want to introduce here, and that's namespace. That's more or less the same as domain. So if you look at, for example, LinkedIn, that's a domain where you log in with your username and password. So it gives context to identifiers. For example, I log in to LinkedIn with my email address, and that email address has a different meaning in another application. For example, in Instagram or in Twitter. The second term is cryptography. Cryptography is, there's a very complicated definition on the sheet, but it's like a secret language, you could say. If you have an amount of data, digital data on your website or on your computer, and you encrypt that data, then you can't read it anymore. It's a lot of, signs, numbers, you can't really make sense of it. It's gibberish. And another very important characteristic of that process of encrypting is that it's one way. You can go from the data to the encrypted data, but you can't go back. So there's nothing in the result that points back to the original data. Another word in our digital identity field is root of trust. So the root of trust is a replacement of the human-based trust. So for example, if I go to the bank, to my bank, I log in, then I trust the bank to run their website well and offer me services and manage my digital identity there, so that I can get those services from the bank, like paying or insurances or whatever, receiving money. What we need is to be sure that the root of trust is in our hands in the future. Because if the bank wants to get rid of my identity, then I can't take it out of there and go somewhere else with that identifier. So that's the root of trust. The root of trust is a digital alternative for the username password, mostly based on public-private key pairs, and this root of trust makes it possible that you control the identifier yourself. For example, if you are in China, the government controls your identifiers, and it's mandatory in China that you keep your mobile phone on all the time. If you don't run certain apps on your mobile phone and you don't have your geolocator up and running, then you risk a fine, and you risk that your social points go down in China, and that system is called Sesame. So you don't control your identifiers on Sesame. We got the same sort of system in India. It's called Aadhaar. It's a centralized, totally centralized system. You don't control your identifiers, and the state, in fact, manages them. And they run, of course, the risk to be hacked, etc., and that wrong conclusions are drawn from the data. So maybe you think this isn't possible in Europe or the US, but even in Europe and the US, these kind of systems can evolve to systems where we have a totalitarian state or a surveillance state. And we have to be very careful that that happens. And happily, autonomic identifiers come into play. I have to be honest with you, because autonomic identifiers aren't there yet. So they are still coded at the moment and tested. But I promise you, in 5 or 10 years, they will certainly be here, and you will get to use them. So what about trying to test with them and already know more about them? And, for example, use them a little bit. And we tried that at the end of the presentation. Decentralized identifiers. Allow me a detour to youngsters. Youngsters, I talked to my daughter yesterday or the day before yesterday, and I asked her, what is your problem? Do you feel that you have a problem on the internet? And she said, well, maybe the social media where you put something on there, a photograph or a statement, maybe a bit of a political statement, maybe a dumb thing that you've said before. Sometimes you can get rid of it, sometimes not. If you, for example, make a reply to a post from somebody else. And that doesn't feel very free, you know, you want to revoke what you've said before. So if you relate to this kind of feeling on the internet, keep watching, because we will tell you how this will evolve in the future. So the why of decentralized identifiers is that we want to have more control, more trust, more trustworthiness of your identifier, and that means that you want to know who said something and what somebody said. And you might reason, well, I know that already on the internet, that's no problem, I already have that. But the problem is the veracity of it. You can't be sure that it's really said by this person and really said exactly that this person said that what you get. So we need the control, we need the trust, and we need more privacy. And the good thing is that a video will show now how that can work in the future. It's a video made by Microsoft, and it's called The Explanation of Decentralized Identity. Have a look.
Can enable such digital credentials to work everywhere, be more trustworthy, and respect privacy. Here's how it works. Meet Alice. Her new digital wallet empowers her to own and control credentials. Since it's not tied to any one organization, authoritative sources can confidently issue standards-based credentials to Alice. When Alice presents these credentials, websites and apps can check that they're valid, for example by confirming with a university that she's a student there, and then grant access accordingly. While this process may be easier, how do we know it's trustworthy? Decentralized identifiers leverage proven cryptographic systems. When Alice presents her credentials, her digital wallet generates a unique identifier and signs it using a private key, secured by a biometric proof or PIN that only she knows. The uniquely paired public key is published to a distributed ledger. Alice can present her digital student ID card to a bookstore, and before granting a discount, the bookstore can confirm that the university issued the card to Alice. This experience mimics what Alice does today. She can digitally present and authenticate a set of verifiable credentials just as she would present a physical card. And she can revoke them with a single click, just as she would return a card to her wallet. Best of all, these digital cards are private. This puts Alice in sole control of her digital identity. She makes the decisions for it. Verifiable credentials will make it easier to stay in control and help unlock a more trustworthy internet that respects privacy for all of us.
Great to have you back, and thanks for watching the film. A test question for you. If you've seen this video and studied it, what are these things on the slide? And if you've seen the video, of course, these are attestations, these are virtual credentials. And how does this work out when we have virtual credentials digitally? That was, of course, the subject of the whole video. And I want to conclude that with an anecdote. Romeo and Julia, they were in love. And Romeo went to the website of the jeweler. And he bought a pair of rings. And he wanted, of course, to propose to Julia. What happened was that Romeo had to sign a few general terms of the jeweler, and they said, and of course Romeo didn't read them, but the jeweler made him sign a statement that the jeweler could use the purchase, the data of the purchase, to market his products So you might be able to imagine what happened next. Well, Julia got from all over the world congratulations to her wedding to be, but Romeo had not proposed Julia yet. And this is a real life example that really happened, and the EU decided to say enough is enough, and we are going to create a law, a privacy law. It's called the GDPR. In the Netherlands it's called the AVG. This law should protect your privacy and the reuse of your data for other means than just, in this case, the purchase of the rings. But is this law really protective? And if it intends to do so, will it really work? The problem is that any jeweler, any site can be hacked. Any data in the database of a site can be combined, or from the data can be drawn wrong conclusions. We call those false positives and false negatives. An example of a false positive is that you come with your, you try to leave the car park with your car and you haven't paid. But the barrier will open anyway. So that's a false positive. The false negative is the other way around. You have paid and you find yourself waiting for a barrier that won't open. These are just examples, but you can imagine that as soon as you start drawing conclusions from data that describe people and you make mistakes, that really bad things can happen. What we can't discuss today are a few things, because the whole identity world is very broad, it's complex and extensive. So we won't talk anymore about identity because it's too broad and too vague. We've seen that before. And we will focus on public identifiers, not the private ones. The private ones are to exchange value or information between two people or two organizations, or people and organizations. So we won't talk about that anymore. We will focus on public identifiers. And what is a public identifier? That is, for example, an email address or a Twitter handle, a Twitter name. And as you might know, you can add value to those identifiers, like, for example, likes or retweets or mentions. These are values that you can store on Twitter to your identifier. And this is also just an example. And we want to consider public identifiers and how to control them and to be more trustworthy with them and to have them more private in terms of privacy. So they are public, you can see them, but you get to decide whether somebody sees them. That's the main and very important difference. You decide who gets to see your identity data. What we won't do either is consider organizations and devices. We might need much more time to discuss that and how that works. Key management is, I would say, literally key to your decentralized identifiers. If you don't manage your keys, not your identity. And we've copied that statement from the cryptocurrency world, where they say, not your keys, not your coins. So we've seen a lot of theft of cryptocurrencies in the past 10 years because people don't manage their keys well enough. But this is also a vast area to cover, and we can't do that today. What we do today is you control, and therefore you are, and you get to decide. we want to have control over our identifiers. And how that works out, we already saw that in the video, and I will repeat it, is that you get your virtual keys. These keys are, like I've introduced before, the public-private key pairs. These are a modern version of username and password, where the username is the public key, everybody can see that one, and the password is the private key. You could also compare a public-private key pair to a physical key and a lock. And the lock is transparent, so you can see what's in the lock, but you can't open it. So you have to be carefully managing your keys there, of course, but as soon as you've done that, then your identifier is to some extent public, and you decide how public it is. And you can connect all kinds of attestations, verifiable, that are called verifiable credentials too. So you can connect them to the identifier. And then you can send them to people and they can verify them by themselves. And we saw how that worked in the video. A small revisit of the fundamentals behind digital identifiers. And of course, it could be a bit boring, but it's very essential that you get this step. So maybe take a pen and note, because what you see on top is a person, and we call that person a controller. So that could be an individual. And this individual has an identifier. You see that to the bottom right. And this individual uses its keys that we've just discussed to control this identifier. So what can go wrong in this situation? We can illustrate this by what happened to the President of the United States, Trump. He was on Twitter, as we all know, and Twitter shut him down. And maybe it's okay to cut him down because, you didn't like him anyway. But Twitter had their general terms, and they said, well, Trump did not follow the conditions of Twitter, so we stop him as a Twitter identifier. But is that okay that Trump can't take his identifier with him, with all his relations, with all his tweets, with all his likes, all his mentions? Isn't it fair that he takes that with him and goes to another platform that would like to serve him? I think it is. I think it's a fundamental right that we have control over our own digital identifiers and that they should be portable. So I can transfer them from one platform to the other. We don't have any mechanism of issuing digital cards like I've shown you before, the plastic ones. We don't have that at the moment. There are no universal means of exchanging and expressing and verifying digital credentials across organizational boundaries. So that means I can't transfer my Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain to the Ethereum blockchain, for example. I can't transfer my Twitter identity to LinkedIn. Why not? Well, it wasn't possible before, so we can't blame all those organizations and those big corps for that. Because when the internet was invented, it was simply not possible, cryptographically not possible, to arrange that for us on the internet. So in fact, the internet is broken because we are limited, we are locked in domains, and we can't get out of it. But now, fortunately, we have these autonomic identifiers. As I said before, they're not there yet, but they're coming. And the good news is we can start to practice with them without them being live yet. We can use the old school identifiers to practice with them. So hold on, we'll get there. First, a small history lesson here on this slide. To the left you see the administrative identity systems. These are the old identity systems that we've discussed. Username, login, password, and your identity is not yours. Not your keys, not your identity. So then we found out that there are blockchains, and blockchains are immutable, they are uncensorable, they are decentralized, distributed, and a lot of those words. What it actually means is that your identifier can be attached to a neutral ledger somewhere out there, and nobody can control it ultimately. And that was of course new 10 years ago, that we could do that. But then there is another extension of these features, because what we've seen using blockchains for identifiers is that they are still ledger locked. So as I said before, I can't move Bitcoin to Ethereum and backwards, and vice versa, sorry. So we can't move identifiers that are locked, that are anchored to the Bitcoin blockchain to Ethereum. We can't do that. And then the autonomic identifiers were invented. And they have all the features that you can actually port them to a data structure that is portable across all the systems. When I discussed blockchains with Professor Bart Jacobs, I think 5 years ago, Bart Jacobs is from the University of Nijmegen, and they promote an administrative, so to the left, the one to the left, administrative identity system that's called IRMA. It has features of decentralized IDs, but fundamentally it's the architecture is the one to the left. So I discussed blockchains with him, and he waved them goodbye like, oh no, that's a hype. I don't even want to discuss them. And he's right. Blockchains are a hype. And they still are a hype. But I think Mr. Jacobs has underestimated the importance of blockchains in the long haul. And that is because nobody has control over those identifiers ultimately, and they are registered on an immutable ledger, which is ambient available, so it's everywhere in the world. You can always access it. There's two features that these blockchains did not have, and they are very important. I want to take you down that road for 2 minutes, and then we get back out of the nerd zone. Two features. One is privacy. If you ledger lock your identifiers on blockchain, that's where you risk that they become public and they can be associated. So for example, if I have a Bitcoin address, which is a public identifier on the blockchain, it's immutable, I can't erase it. And somebody binds that to my person, to me individually, that's where it gets nasty privacy-wise. No? And the other one is portability. And that's exactly what autonomic identifiers have solved. That problem we solve with autonomic identifiers. So where we will go in the end is that Julia, she has her digital autonomic identifier on her phone, and it works just like physical cards, and we've seen that on the video too, but this is a revisit and a wrap-up of that. She can use her phone to issue or to share her virtual credentials with everybody, and they can independently verify them. The table shows, let's say, a sort of conclusion about autonomic identifiers, and it's all green to the right, of course. So the most important difference with blockchain-based identifiers is that you don't have to rely operationally on a third party. And that's very important, as we've seen before. So now, what can we do today if we want to go ahead with autonomic identifiers? We can test them on the internet. And that sounds maybe a bit strange because we don't have them yet. They are not there. They are being coded. They are being tested at the moment. And what we could do is use the old school identifiers and use them in a slightly in a different new way. And let me tell you how you could do that. For example, you might be a youngster of 30 years old, male, but try to imagine that you're a grandma that loves gardening. And then you start thinking about a new identifier that represents Granny. And what do you need to do to get that going, for example, on Facebook? Think of it. You know, try to think of what you need to do to create an identifier or a login at Facebook. Well, normally you have to register your phone number, you have to register your email address, and then they will send you a confirmation code, and you will confirm that using your regular Wi-Fi and internet connection at home, and then you get your new identifier. What is the big problem of this? What is happening here is that you are bound from the beginning to your regular phone number, to your regular email address, and to your internet infrastructure, your IP address, for example. So even though you'd like to create a pseudonymous grandmother that loves gardening and has very bold statements or opinions about politics, for example, you can't do it. So now try to think of what you can do to create an identifier using Facebook. And what should you do? You know? And if you think about that, let's start with the phone number. Well, you need to go and buy a prepaid card. And be sure that you don't pay with your bank account, because your bank account is attached to your real you, and there goes your granny. You know, you don't have a pseudonymous granny because they know exactly that granny is you. So you pay cash, and then you get back home, you go on the Facebook site. What should you do next? How can you cover up that you live where you live? So you need IP vanishes. You know, you need to cover your IP address. There's software you can find that. You have to create, let's say, a real life name, because once you start telling not the truth about yourself, which of course you do when you create an identifier, is you have to do that consistently, because they might ask you, how old are you in 3 months, and then you forgot what you've put in. So you use software, and it's available on the internet. Just Google it, that lets you create fake identities. Whoa, everybody says fake identities, that's for criminals. I think that's a bit of a giant leap towards conclusions, because what we only try to do is try to keep our privacy and our control over our own identifiers. That's what we are trying to do. We don't have them yet. As I said before, they will be here in 5 or 10 years, but we can still practice with them. So that's the first step. Try to find out how you can create a digital identifier on Facebook that is not trackable to yourself. Then another challenge. Now simply try to pay for some service on the internet with the granny identifier. Just go and try to do it. What happens is that you have to go to your bank account and you have to share your bank account, and that again binds you to your regular identifier and identity, in this case, you. So you don't want that. So let me give you a hint. Use cryptocurrencies to pay. And then when that is all done and you've done some bold statements about gardening and politics on the internet, maybe it's time to associate yourself to the identifier. So what I mean is tell your friends within certain domains, maybe only your friends from the football team, you tell those friends about the fact that you're also this pseudonymous granny that talks about gardening. And just feel what happens. You know, is trust involved? Do people think you're strange? Have you acted the way you would have done as being yourself? Or have you played a role as a granny? And the last step is, and it's very, I have to get back to that one. The funny thing about this is that you can start to control what you do with your identifier, isn't it? You decide with who you share this identifier and with who you don't share your identifier. And the last part is say goodbye to your temporary identifier. We also call them ephemeral identifiers. A bit of a difficult word there. But you only use it for a short period of time. Now try to get rid of your identifier in like 2 or 3 months after you've put some, you had some conversations on Facebook with that identifier. And just see what happens. Try to get rid of it. A friend of mine, a good friend of mine, passed away last year, and his honest family tried to get rid of his identifiers on the internet. Wish them luck, because my friend was a programmer and he knew very well what privacy is on the internet. So he did the best he could to use strong passwords and to hide a bit on the internet. So it's very difficult to delete your identifier everywhere. Just give it a go. It's interesting to do. So to summarize this, we've been talking about surveillance and totalitarian control, which is possible everywhere in the world. Don't point to China only, don't point to India, just look at ourselves here in Europe and the US. And for digital identity, cryptography is our last resort to regain privacy, security and self-sovereignty. This is our last bet. And with autonomic, decentralized identifiers, you control, therefore you are, and you get to decide. We started to practice, and you can take it from here yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henk, for that wonderful presentation on digital identity and where we're heading with our personal data. I'm not really familiar with most of this material, but I'm quite intrigued right now, and I am definitely interested in learning more about all that. I can imagine you're watching at home, might have some questions or can be very interested as well in learning more about both Henk and his projects. So make sure to check the slides which we will send to you by email for his contact details and connect with him on LinkedIn. Again, our speaker is Henk van Cann, so you can find him there as well. He is also publishing an article with more in-depth information on all these topics on Medium, so we will make sure to send that to you as well via email. Now, make sure to join us on our live Q&A with Henk on Zoom. You can find the link in your email and in the chat. So hop on over there, join us there, ask all your questions, whether they are on a beginner level or perhaps more advanced. And while you're waiting for the Zoom room to open up, head on over to www.changexcommunity.com and sign up for our next event, which will take place in June, which is a LinkedIn workshop all about the 5 steps to more success on LinkedIn, and more importantly, how to achieve that in a way that's authentic to you. This workshop will be presented by Wietske van Iersel, who is a LinkedIn expert. Now, if you can't make it to the live Q&A, very unfortunate, but I wish you a great evening, and I hope to welcome the rest of you on the live Zoom call. So thanks for watching for now, and hope to see you in a bit.